Shabbat Shalom. This week's Torah portion is Behukotai, and it begins with God establishing a very clear set of principles. If we follow His commandments, then we will benefit from a whole list of wonderful things. And if we do not follow His commandments, then we will have a series of very terrible things happen to us. I would like to focus on the beginning of the Torah portion, which talks about the good things. It's very short, and I would like to read it to you. If you walk in my ordinances and keep my commandments and do them, then I will give you rain in its season, and the land shall yield its produce, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. And your threshing shall reach unto the vintage, and the vintage shall reach unto the sowing time. And you shall eat your bread to the full, and abide in your land safely. Until now, we see that the rewards have to do with the lushness of the land, the produce that it will yield, and the fact that we will live securely in our land. And I will give peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and none shall make you tremble. And I will rid evil beasts out of the land, neither shall the sword pass through the land. And you shall pursue your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. And 5 of you shall pursue 100, and 100 of you shall pursue 10,000, and your enemies shall fall before you by the sword. This next section, of course, talks about the fact that peace will reign in the land. And it's interesting. On the one hand, we have a supernatural kind of occurrence where animals or beasts that normally disturb human beings, that are a threat to human beings, they will no longer be in the land. But then we see a battle. We see that we will actually battle the enemy, but we will kill them, we will prevail. For I will turn to you and make you fruitful and multiply you and establish my covenant with you. Okay, here we get to the best part. God will establish His covenant with us. Now, we already have a covenant with God, and it is the do's and don'ts that are implicit here that make up the content of this covenant. But as a result of us fulfilling our part of the covenant, God says He will establish, He will essentially implement His covenant with us. This is part of the covenant. And you shall eat store of former years and bring forth that of former years because of the new. And I will set, okay, this basically talks about there'll be such a wealth of produce every year that you will have still remaining crops from the previous year that you are going to have to clear space in order to make room for the new crops. Incredible bounty, incredible production. Okay, and then we get to a more spiritual development. And I will set my dwelling amongst you, and my soul shall not loathe you. Now, the use here of the word my dwelling is the word mishkan. The mishkan is the word for the tabernacle. And this, of course, refers to the temple. That there will be a temple, that God will have His temple, His dwelling place being among you. And this, of course, refers to the fact that in times when Israel is deserving, there is a temple in our midst. King David, when he completed his temple, his battle, Solomon, his son, was able to build a temple. And that represented the crowning glory of a peaceful time and a time when Israel would be in its land and would obey God. And of course, when the children of Israel were evil, stopped obeying God's commandments, then the ultimate punishment was the destruction of the temple. So very much a part of the good things that we are promised here is the dwelling of the temple. And I will walk among you and will be your God, and you shall be my people. This is a relationship between God and the Jewish people and the people of Israel. God will walk amongst us. He will dwell among us, and He will walk amongst us. So in other words, He will not just be dwelling within a tabernacle, which is in the middle of the country, but He will walk amongst us. We will feel His presence throughout the land. And the ultimate verse here, verse 13, I am the eternal your God, who brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, that you should not be their servants, and I have broken the bands of your yoke, and made you go upright. We have here then God explaining that He brought us out of Egypt. He liberated us from being slaves to Egypt, in order for them, and has broken the yoke that is upon us, the yoke of other nations who have enslaved us, who have persecuted us, and he has allowed us to walk upright. This is a marvelous description of freedom. Ironically, of course, this freedom, the price of this freedom is indeed slavery. A different kind of slavery, though, because what we have to do as this section begins, what we have to do is, if you walk in my ordinances and keep my commandments. For us to be free, we have to agree to submit ourselves to God. And this, of course, is the paradox of the relationship between God and the Jewish people, and perhaps God and humanity, that is set forth in the Bible. When God released us from Egypt, he did so to bring us to Sinai so that we would submit ourselves to God. Now, many people have talked about, what does it mean to have freedom? What does freedom mean? And very often, freedom is confused with anarchy. Freedom is assumed to be the absence of any authority, the absence of any obligation. That, of course, is not freedom, because a human being by nature must have a goal, must have a set of do's and don'ts that they may follow. Call it a moral code, call it a religious code. But human beings, in order to do good things, in order to remain moral human beings, must follow rules. If they if they throw off the yoke of any rules, then they become slaves to their passions. They become slaves to their basest desires. And in that situation, whether we're talking about an individual human being who has no rules and no conscience and does whatever he wants, becomes a destructive person, becomes a person who cannot control his own passions and his own evil inclinations, because he has no basis, no guidelines of which to subdue those evil inclinations. And the same is true of a society. A society without law, a society without structure, is a self-destructive society. If we think about the societies that we met in the Bible that were depraved, we think, of course, of Sodom and Gomorrah. And these are places that the Bible tells us, and the Midrash expounds upon this. There was social anarchy. People mistrusted one another. People stole from one another. People sexually abused one another. There was no kindness. There was no welcome of the stranger. And at the end of a society like that is they destroy themselves. And of course, in the case of Sodom, God came along and helped that destruction. We see a very similar type of society in the city of Gibeah that we meet in the Bible at the end of the book of Judges, where these people attack this woman, and it of course becomes a it's a place that they didn't want to host a stranger, and then end up attacking the stranger's concubine, and it is a self-destructing society, which of course leads to civil war. This is a society that has no God. But this is a society that has no king, has no rules. Freedom, therefore, is not freedom from all rules. Freedom is freedom from dictatorship. Freedom is to be free of the yoke of a tyrannous leader, of someone who creates rules that are not for the good of society, but for his own personal good. It is a society that enslaves people, that takes advantage of people. The rules and the laws that God have given to us safeguards us from that situation. Because if we serve God, we will then not need to serve another master. And this concept, I believe, is many times people who have suffered. If we look at the Jewish people, for example, who for centuries were subject to all sorts of persecution. And we know that in so many cases it was faith in God and observance of the commandments that kept the people alive, even as they may have been, individuals were killed or persecuted. But as a nation, this faith and this loyalty to God's commandments is what kept the nation alive. It kept people in hope. It prevented them from sinking into despair. What is the connection? Because when you know that your ultimate master is God, if you know that you obey his commandments, you are submitting to his will, then the will of any lesser master is no longer relevant. If you have that moral compass that gives you guidance and gives you an understanding of what is expected of you and what you need to do in order to fulfill what God wants of you, then you're free. And then it doesn't matter if a person comes to you, a king, no matter how powerful he is, if he comes to you and insists that you do something, that you violate the commandments, that you adopt a different faith, that you do something that you know is in direct contravention of what God has set forth in the Bible, you have the freedom to stand up to him and say no, because you obey a higher master. That is freedom. And this is the freedom that God is setting forth for us in this section also. I have broken the bands of your yoke and made you go upright. Shabbat Shalom from Samaria.